Hi guys. Today we're starting our last section of this part of chapter 4. We're going to do almost like a pre-lesson about how to solve by completing the square. Today we will not be solving anything, but more we will be getting prepared for how to do a completing the square problem. Tomorrow and Wednesday is when we will learn how to solve the full thing by completing the square. Completing the square is the final way that we are learning to solve a quadratic equation. Remember, we've already learned solving by factoring and solving by the quadratic formula. To be successful at completing the square, we need to fully understand how perfect square trinomials work. Perfect square trinomials are something that we learned in our factoring chapter. Here are two examples of perfect square trinomials. Now, we did learn this in our trinomial factor. That was our previous chapter 4. And we had a whole video about perfect square trinomials. But, I mean, technically, you could solve a perfect square trinomial by just doing Xbox. But that's not going to help us today with completing the square because we need to understand how a perfect square works. So I'm going to do a really quick refresher on the special way of factoring a perfect square trinomial. So when we're factoring a perfect square trinomial, there were three things that needed to happen. We needed the first number to be a perfect square, something I can square root. We need the last number to be a perfect square, something that I can square root. And for it to be something I can square root, it also has to be positive. So make sure the last number is positive. And then when we times those by 2, we needed that to equal the middle term. Now, it didn't matter if the middle term was positive or negative. We just needed it to equal the middle term. Once we decided that those three things happened, then we could write our final answer. And for our final answer, we took the square root of the first term, the sign from the middle term, and the square root from the last term. And we put it in a parentheses and we put a square on the outside. And so when I factored this, it turned into m minus 5 squared. Let's take a look at this second one because it's a little bit trickier, right? So I can square root the first term. It turns into a 9y. I can square root the last term. It is positive, and the square root of 16 is 4. And then I need to check and see if I times that by 2, right? So 2 times 4 is 8, and 8 times 9 is 72. And so this is a perfect square trinomial. And so for my factoring, I'm going to take the 9y, this plus sign, and this 4, and I'm going to put it in a parentheses squared. So 9y plus 4 squared. So that's just really quickly how to factor something that is a perfect square trinomial. Now, today's lesson, though, is called completing the square. And so we're going to be given things that are incomplete perfect square trinomials. It's going to have the first two terms, but it's going to be missing the third term. And so our job today is to figure out, like, what is the missing third term? What can I put at the end of the problem so that this is definitely a perfect square trinomial? So here is our first example. So here I have part of a perfect square trinomial. I am missing the third term. That's where we're going to complete the square. We're going to fill in the missing third term to make it a perfect square trinomial. Now we can use the concepts from the previous slide where we were factoring perfect square trinomials to figure out what goes in that blank space. So when we're factoring a perfect square trinomial, we square root the first term. Normally we would square root the last term, but like I don't know what the last term is, so I'm just going to put a blank space here. And then if we multiplied that by 2, then we would get the middle term. Now we definitely, it has to equal the middle term because we definitely want it to be a perfect square trinomial. So now we just need to fill in the blanks. So on the red line that I wrote, x times 2 times what makes 6x. And that what is a 3, right? X times 2 times 3 makes 6x. And then remember that on that blank space, that was supposed to be the square root of the number above it. And so if I square that number, that should tell me what the number above it should be. So 3 squared is 9, right? So right, because the square root of 9 is 3. And so I've now completed the square. So I filled in the blank space to create a perfect square trinomial. Now, I also want you guys to practice writing out what the factored version of this is. So I also want to write out that the factored version is x plus 3 squared. And that's just going to help us prepare for tomorrow's lesson. All right, let's try another one. Okay, so here's my next problem. So again, I'm going to square root the first number. I can't square root the last number because there's not a last number. So I'm going to put a blank space. And when I times this by 2, I should get the middle term. Now remember, we're not paying attention to the sign of the middle term right now. The sign is going to come into play when we do our parentheses squared. So for right now, ignore the sign and just do the 20x. Okay, so x times 2 times 10 would make 20x. 10 squared is 100. So the missing term is 100. And then to practice our factoring, I am going to put it as a parentheses squared. So this one would be x minus 10 squared. Let's do one more just for good luck, and then you guys can start your homework. So here is our last problem. And this is all you're going to be doing on tonight's homework as well. So filling in the missing part and then practicing factoring. So on this one, the square root of z squared is z. I don't know what the last term is. And when I times it by 2, it's supposed to equal 7z. Now this one's a little bit weird because my middle number is odd. And actually, normally I wouldn't ask you to solve by completing the square if the middle number is odd, because it gets just super weird because it has fractions and it's just not fun. So, but for completing the square, it's not too difficult. Not too difficult. So let's try to figure this out. And it might happen on your Delta Math tonight too. So it's important that we can do these. So z times 2 times what makes 7z? And when it's odd, basically what I do is I take the odd number and I just put it over 2. Because then the 2 and the divided by 2, those will cancel out. Okay, so 7 over 2. And then I am going to square this whole thing. So when I put it back up in the blank space, it's going to be 49 over 4. So I squared both numbers. So 49 over 4 is what goes in the blank space. And then the factoring part, that's not difficult because you've already written out everything that you need to know. It's this z, it's this minus sign, and it's this 7 over 2. So you're not even really, you have to do a little bit of math. You have to square 2 numbers, and that's it. Everything else, pretty straightforward. So just be aware that that might happen on your Delta Math, and so be prepared to write down fractions. And that is our pre-lesson today about completing the square. So tomorrow and Wednesday, I'll have lessons about how to actually solve using this method of creating a perfect square trinomial.